and see what your peers are working on. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Boone.
Hi. All right. So this week's invited speaker is Dr. Paul Taillie. He is an assistant professor at UNC. We go back to, he came to the University of Florida to do a postdoc while I was doing a PhD there. He lived in the Triangle, would come down and get do some field work and things like that together. Really efficient, lots of fun to work with. Summarizing your research, lots of coastal work, lots of disturbance work. Not necessarily uncharismatic species, but overlooked charismatic species.
Hard to find.
Hard to find. Usually they're really cute, but like people don't think rodents are cute because they're wrong. Lots of bird work, ghost spores. So he'll talk a little bit about climate change. Well, a lot about climate change. What is your current department?
Geography and environment.
There we go. Geography and environment. Actually, I have it written down here, but that assistant, so I knew whether assistant or associate. So Paul's been a pleasure to work with. I've gotten to work on a number of projects with him, a number of papers with him. Great collaborator, someone that is one of the only people I've ever written with that always hits the deadlines. And then also I learned a lot with how to manage things when you are the person in charge of the paper, when you're the first author. Like I send something out and I give people too much freedom to give me comments back, and he gives like, here's the deadlines, these are the kind of comments I want. Let me know if I don't hear anything I'm submitting, which actually I take a lot of, learned a lot from, because I get tons of comments because I leave the door open and it slows things down. So with that, relatively interesting introduction. This is Paul Taillie.
Well, I appreciate that, Wes. Yeah, I mean, our group at Florida was great. There's lots of really engaged graduate students, and yeah, it was a great place to do my postdoc. Yeah, so I'm going to talk mostly about a few things, but the kind of unifying theme is extreme weather. And the thing about extreme weather is it's inherently kind of rare. It's extreme, so it doesn't happen very often, which creates a challenge because typically our research projects are going to be in the kind of couple of years, 2 years to 4 years sort of time span, and we may not get an extreme weather event in that time span. So one of the things that I've been doing to try and address that challenge is to replicate kind of historical studies or projects, investigations. Though some of them have been projects from my collaborators, some of them are like my own projects that I've done in the past that I'm doing again to kind of see how things have changed. And so I'm really interested in these kind of decadal changes that we normally are only able to investigate with secondary data and trying to take a primary data collection approach to looking at some of these things. And so kind of what you'll see is I'll present some stuff from my PhD a decade ago, and some of the newer stuff that we're doing now to kind of build on that. So yeah, just to kind of describe generally what my research is about. I'm kind of classically trained in wildlife ecology. My PhD lab, my postdoc lab are all very kind of emphasize the importance of field work. And then kind of after my PhD, moving into my postdoc, well, kind of throughout I was, there's always been kind of a spatial component to my work. And I kind of see the world in maps. So I do a lot of that, and there was always some remote sensing involved, but it wasn't until after my PhD that I started to kind of dive into the remote sensing world myself. And so we've been trying to kind of scale up some of the things that we've been doing to more regional scales with that. And kind of the types of things that, so again, kind of starting with my PhD. Before that, I had been interested in disturbance, things like wildfire. But during my PhD, I started to work in coastal systems and was just really excited about all the different types of disturbance happening in coastal systems. It creates this really interesting dynamic sort of environment. And so that's, a lot of my work now is kind of, again, kind of building on that kind of coastal theme and with these extreme weather events. Yeah, so I'll mostly talk about ghost forests, and then I'll kind of talk about a different project towards the end. But one, just to orient you in kind of across the mid-Atlantic and in parts of the Southeast, the coastal environments look something like this, where we've got a marsh that is, we've got these kind of coastal herbaceous marsh species that can tolerate stress in the form of inundation and saltwater exposure. And these are things that trees, like here we've got pond pine, are not able to tolerate so well. And so what happens is, as sea levels rise, salt water moves inland, we get these stands of dead trees, again, because those trees can't tolerate these stressful conditions. So these stands of dead trees we refer to as ghost forests. And at the beginning of my PhD, in talking to our collaborators at the Fish and Wildlife Service and other places, they were concerned about the death of trees and wanted to stop the death of trees and figure out, like, why are these trees dying so we can kind of stop this. But as I started to work on this project more, I started to notice the snags that were still standing, or stumps in the marshes, kind of revealing that these marshes used to be forest a long time ago too. So I started to think about this more as ghost forests are really one step in this transition from forest to marsh. And also that marshes have a lot of conservation value in the form of ecosystem services. Just in terms of animals, they support really cool animals that you don't tend to find in other places. So I started to, I think I'll kind of, over the course of the talk, we'll kind of make this case that maybe we shouldn't be stopping this forest mortality, but maybe even facilitating it to kind of try and facilitate this transition to marsh and capitalize on some of those ecosystem services provided by coastal wetlands. Real quick, so kind of building this case, marshes are cool because they have two different processes that help them kind of adjust to changing sea levels. So sea level has been changing for a long time in geologic past. And so there are these kind of built-in mechanisms that marshes have to deal with changing sea levels. So one is they're pretty efficient in how they can kind of move upslope and downslope. So when sea levels rise, these kind of coastal communities can move upslope. We call this kind of horizontal marsh migration, where they're moving landward. And then also they can kind of move upward vertically. And so they do this by, when they get inundated by more water, or by tides or something like that, or a storm surge, they're really good at kind of trapping sediment from the water, whether that's organic sediment or mineral sediments. And they kind of trap that, accumulate it over time. Their roots expand upwards, and so the one platform grows vertically. There's a kind of this feedback where the more they're inundated, the more sediment they're trapping, and the more they're growing upwards. And so they tend to be a little bit more resilient to rising sea level than kind of more terrestrial systems. And so yeah, that's just a little background. But so our kind of broad research questions here are, one, to understand how coasts are changing, kind of the spatial and temporal dynamics of the formation of ghost forests. So where are ghost forests forming? And kind of is this a gradual kind of forest mortality, or is it happening episodically? And kind of using those spatial and temporal patterns, trying to make inferences about mechanisms. So is this related to sea level rise by itself? Is it more of an interaction with other types of disturbance that are maybe related to a changing climate? So things like more frequent or intense hurricanes, droughts, things like that. And then ultimately thinking about kind of how wildlife communities are reshaped by these kind of new and evolving vegetation conditions. The area that we're working in mostly is this part of northeastern North Carolina, specifically this part here called the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula. And this is a really great spot to study these sorts of questions because it's, we've got really low elevations across a large area. So it's really vulnerable to rising sea level. But then there's lots of opportunities for things like marsh migration, because a lot of this is kind of low elevation coastal forest that is mostly public land because it wasn't used for other things. So we've got a lot of national wildlife refuges, some state game lands, other properties, and not too much in the way of development. So there's lots of opportunities for marsh migration here. The other thing that's cool is that we have this nice salinity gradient. And so we've got, this is the Albemarle, Albemarle sound up here, and you can see it's mostly fresh. So really low salinities. And then we've got, high salinities out in the ocean, obviously. And then the barrier islands here on the outside, only have a few inlets to the ocean. And so there's minimal exchange with the ocean. And this sets up this nice salinity gradient where we've got kind of higher salinities over here. And then they decrease as you go north because there's no inlets up here. These salinity dynamics are a product of lots of things. So tides, rising sea levels, you can see the effect of wind. So this is just over the course of one day. So as the winds change, you can kind of see salt water moving inland. But then also there's an effect of freshwater input. So we've got rivers, the Roanoke River flows in up here, the Neuse River. So these are, what an estuary is the kind of interface between this input of freshwater and kind of butting up against the salt water of the ocean and how those mix together. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is thinking about the kind of watershed scale ecohydrology, where kind of things like precipitation and evapotranspiration are going to have influence on seasonal fluxes of freshwater into estuaries, and that kind of moves. Again, all of this is about how salinity is moving around, because that's ultimately kind of what's killing trees. So to investigate this, so I found this is kind of an interesting aside. So I didn't start my PhD until I guess it was 2015, and I was kind of looking for ways to study this process that is kind of long term. And I was thinking about my kind of best opportunity to do this was a sort of space for time sort of substitution, where we would look at how vegetation communities were different across a salinity gradient, and kind of just make infer that we would expect changes in the future to kind of move towards those more saltwater dependent communities. But it turns out someone had already done that as a graduate student at Duke in 2004. But they didn't publish it. It was in their dissertation. So I reached out I asked my advisor, I was like, can I just reach out to this person? So I did. I kind of proposed this idea of resampling these vegetation plots that were set up back in 2004. And so this was done by Ben Poulter, and he was into it, and he gave me all of his data and the coordinates of all the plots, and we went out and resampled those. So I then worked with him on a couple of other projects as well, but it all started from a random email. And so his experimental design that he set up was, we've got these 5 sites. Again, they kind of cover this gradient of salinity around the peninsula. So 5 sites, and then within each site, we've got 21 plots, 21 of these, let's see, they're 12-meter radius plots where we inventoried all vegetation. And the plots within a site are then stratified across this gradient from forest to marsh, where we've got these marsh plots in this orange color, transition plots in blue, or no, this one's, Swan Carter is weird, they're mixed up. But if we look down here at Long Shoal, so we've got marsh plots in blue, transition in brown, and these forest plots in green. And so some of these, some of these forest plots are no longer forested because of the change, but this is how they were set up back in 2004. So I sampled these in 2016 as a PhD student, and then my PhD student sampled them again last year. And so we've got this really cool kind of multi-decadal time series of vegetation change in this area that's really vulnerable to sea level rise. And so we've also got a little bit of an elevational gradient here, where elevation changes differently at different sites. And so ultimately our kind of question here was, how can we quantify the relative importance of inundation, where we use elevation as a proxy? So if you're lower elevation, you're going to be inundated by water more frequently, versus salt. And so the salt gradient changes kind of differently. It's not a function of elevation. It kind of changes depending on where you are in the estuary. So we measure the DBH of every woody species taller than 2 meters. and identified it to species and whether it was live or dead, in all those 98 vegetation plots. Then we also took soil samples. So here we wanted to get an idea of, we want to quantify salinity, but the salinity in the surrounding water is not necessarily a good representation of the salinity experienced by the tree and how that has implications for tree physiology and ultimately mortality. So we collected soil, had it analyzed for salt concentrations, both in 2004 and then again in 2016. And so what we found is that elevation really didn't predict the sorts of vegetation changes that we were observing. So whether you look at mature trees, saplings, shrubs, all of these things, kind of the change between 2004 and 2016 was better predicted by that level of salinity in the soil versus the elevation. And so another one of my collaborators, Marcelo Ardon at NC State, published this paper around that same, like kind of in the intervening years, where, so this is from a similar site in this same region, where he was continuously monitoring water levels in this impounded wetland, and also measuring salinity. And so you can see in the gray shaded area, this is the water level. So the water goes up and down. And when the water goes down, the salinity goes up, which is maybe kind of counterintuitive if you're thinking about the movement of salt water coming from hurricanes. So there you would think if there's more water around, it's going to be more salt water. But so what Marcelo kind of was illustrating here is that when there's a drought, you have less freshwater input, and that allows salt water to move inland. And so you can kind of see these spikes, particularly at the outflow of this impounded wetland, in salinity during low water years. This is kind of supporting that salt is driving this vegetation change, not necessarily high water events. And then kind of during 2016, this was all complicated by the fact that one of our sites caught on fire and burned in a wildfire. And so this is a picture of just like 2 weeks after the fire stopped burning. And you can see that these marsh grasses respond really, really quickly. So this is, it's important to consider that these are fire maintained systems. They're very well adapted to kind of regenerating following fire. But then when we came out a year later, again, we see lots, marsh grasses responding really quickly, but almost no woody regeneration. So if this was more of a unaffected pond pine forest, we'd see a lot more regeneration of pond pine, and also other shrubs like wax myrtle and things like that. So, this is all complicated by multiple disturbance types kind of interacting together, where we've got fire, and then the regeneration of woody species is kind of limited by the kind of lingering salt in the soil. So there's this interaction between salinization and fire. So ultimately, we've got, we sampled in 2004, we sampled again in 2016, but we have no information on what's going on in between, except for kind of anecdotally. So we know, kind of Marcelo was measuring water levels, and we know that there's a drought in the middle there. We know that there's we can look at fire history in most places, and so we can quantify that. But then it's less clear kind of what was going on. But there are some other papers about ghost forests and claim that hurricanes play a big role. So that there was also, so we see a lot of this ghost forest formation in 2011 or 2012. And some people claim that Hurricane Irene had a big role here. So this was at the end of 2011. But I'm a little bit skeptical of that. But it's really hard to tell when all of these things kind of happen at the same time. So now, to try and get a better sense of the temporal dynamics of all this, my graduate student has been trying to use remote sensing to kind of fill in what's happening in the middle, in between 2004 and 2016. So he's been using Landsat, which is a remote sensing satellite, and then this time series analysis algorithm called continuous change detection and classification. So what this does is it uses the first few years of data to kind of initialize the the model and figure out how much kind of background variability there is, because you've got seasonal change and things like that, seasonal changes in water levels that can influence these signals. After doing that, then we can kind of look at departures from that background variability and try to identify disturbance events. And part of our goal here is to identify acute versus gradual disturbances. So things that kind of happen within a year versus these kind of longer term changes. To look at what some of these things look like. This is one of our sites here. And so we've got 2 periods of drought shown in this kind of tan color. And then the actual observed changes in surface reflectance. So we've got, he's using an EVI here, or the Enhanced Vegetation Index, which combines multiple wavelengths together to get an index of vegetation health. And then we've kind of smoothed that with this green smooth line. And then these vertical dashed lines are acute disturbances identified by that CCDC algorithm. So we can see that these, for this site, these disturbance events kind of align nicely with periods of drought. And also we've got hurricanes in these years as well. So again, I think this kind of reassures us that this method is working fairly well. At Long Shoal, we've got those same drought periods identified here, with no disturbance event identified here, so no vertical dashed line, but a couple other ones over here. So in 2011, this is that one site that burned in 2011. It then burned again in 2016. So both of those fires are showing up nicely. And then 2019 is a little bit different. We're not quite sure what's going on there yet. But again, trying to help elucidate what's going on in these intervening years. And one of the next steps is, so we've so far just done this for this area where we have this existing field data where we can match up our remote sensing observations, with what we've seen in the field to kind of validate these sort of things. And now what we want to do is extend this across the Southeast to these other areas where we know ghost forests have been forming, but vary in their disturbance history. So instead of all of our sites having, these are very large disturbances. Droughts happen over, at the watershed scale. Hurricanes are very large. So if we look, kind of comparing to some of these places on the Gulf Coast of Florida, these are going to have different disturbance histories, different kind of drought histories, that sort of thing. And so we can start to quantify the relative roles of these different disturbance types. And then also interactions between them. So again, kind of one thing that I think we'll probably find here, or my kind of a priori hypothesis, is that hurricanes probably aren't as big of a contributor to ghost forests as the literature suggests. In particular because, so we get these big storm surge events, but hurricanes also have a tremendous amount of rain, and that rain tends to flush salt out of soils. So I don't expect that salinization is as strongly correlated with those that hurricane storm surge. All right, so moving into kind of how wildlife are then responding to these sort of things. So one thing we did early on is we looked at bird communities. Bird communities are kind of nice for studying changes in vegetation structure because they have very predictable responses to vegetation structure. And so what we did was we used LiDAR to kind of to quantify differences in vegetation structure, and then the kind of 2 metrics, LiDAR-derived metrics that were most predictive of bird community composition were mid-story density and canopy density. So we have those plotted here as these various bird species are kind of plotted in this space according to how strong their response was. So these are birds that were more likely to occur at higher levels of canopy density and higher levels of mid-story density. And then down here, we've got birds that are responding, more likely to occur in areas with lower density in both of those 2 vertical strata. And we've got them colored according to their, kind of habitat associations. And so we can kind of see that, as you might expect, species associated with mature forest or closed canopy forest are more likely to occur in these unaffected forests with higher canopy cover. So things like hooded warbler, ovenbird, Acadian flycatcher, these are all kind of iconic closed canopy birds of the southeast. And then as we go down here into these areas that are kind of further along in this transition, things like red-winged blackbird, blue grosbeak, yellow-breasted chat, and northern bobwhite. These are all species that are more associated with either grasslands, shrublands, or early successional communities. And importantly, these are species that are, a lot of them are declining across the southeast because disturbance is just less common on the landscape than it was historically. And so we started to think about these more kind of regional patterns. So this is a map taking those those associations with canopy cover and middle story density. We kind of mapped this out to the whole study area to look at how changes related to the proliferation of ghost forests might compare to other sorts of changes in their habitats. So northern bobwhite, they're associated with early successional vegetation communities and grasslands. And so in areas, so these pink areas are wildfires. And so this, what this map is showing is these create a lot of habitat for northern bobwhite. But then, in these areas where we don't see any historical wildfires, you can kind of see this green is where northern bobwhite became more likely to occur. And so this corresponds with the formation of ghost forests. And so, this kind of forest to marsh transition is creating more habitat for northern bobwhite, which is has been declining across the southeast for many decades. We also looked at marsh birds more closely associated with these kind of coastal marshes. They're not exclusive to coastal marshes, but it does represent a kind of primary habitat for a lot of these. They also have high conservation value, and generally there's a lot of concern about them being vulnerable to rising sea level. And so here again, we kind of do a sort of gradient analysis where we kind of sampled from these outer marshes near the shoreline that are predominantly comprised of juncus or black eating rush, up to the kind of transition zone where we get more snags, maybe some lingering shrubs, and different grasses, so things like cladium or sawgrass, and then maybe some kind of more terrestrial types of grasses like andropogon. And so here we see that a lot of these marsh birds are still more likely to occur in those outer marshes, so they're not quite moving into the transition zone as much. And so this could be, we're not really sure whether this is kind of structural in terms of structural vegetation and cover, kind of a need for cover resources, or if it's primarily driven by food. It might be that these outer marshes have more kind of crabs and snails and things that marsh birds are eating, as opposed to the transition areas. But generally, it seems like kind of what we started talking about with our Fish and Wildlife Service collaborators is that fire might be an important kind of piece or management tool to help facilitate this transition, to help make those transition areas kind of more in line with what we expect marsh bird habitat to be. And so we kind of shifted, or priorities started to shift from we need to prevent forest loss to, well, maybe we should identify areas that are more vulnerable to rising sea level and start to facilitate those changes so we can start to kind of build these more diverse and resilient coastal bird or wildlife communities, and then identify areas that are less vulnerable where we can concentrate efforts on maybe restoring forested wetlands, or something like that. So kind of working closely with the Fish and Wildlife Service to think about what the implications are for management. So more recently, we're basically extending this same sort of work that we were doing with birds to mammals. So this is my other graduate student, Jackie, has been leading this, but she's been using camera traps and deploying them across the same sort of forest marsh gradient. And so we've been using kind of a traditional camera trap deployment at about knee height, targeting kind of medium and large bodied mammals. And then we've also been using these bucket cameras where we've got a camera with a shorter focal distance inside this bucket facing down. And there are holes in the bucket for rodents to come in and out and access a bait cup. So we get better pictures that we're able to identify the species a little bit more readily than a traditional camera trap deployment. And so yeah, we've gotten a bunch. Also with camera trapping in these marsh environments, grasses tend to move around a lot in the winds. We get a lot of false triggers. So Jackie's been using this AI algorithm for separating out pictures with animals versus false triggers called Mega Detector. And it's pretty cool because it can identify animals and gives you a sort of confidence value. So you can adjust that to kind of address false positives and false negatives in different ways. We've gotten a bunch of different animals: marsh rabbits, nutria, raccoon. This little family of black bears here was pretty cool. So she's still kind of sorting through photos. She's got a whole bunch of undergrads helping her go through these. Yeah, we're interested to see. My kind of expectation here is that just like with birds, we'll see that there's a lot of species that are using coastal marshes, and that specifically these transition zones might provide lots of food and cover resources. Specifically for things like bear, there's probably going to be more food resources in these transition zones where the vegetation is closer to the ground versus a lot of these closed canopy forests don't necessarily have much of an understory, so potentially less food. So some of our future questions for this work is, so far we've been looking at occurrence and community composition, but I think it would be interesting to look at animal movement and how animal movement changes as a function of extreme weather event. So in particular, kind of when water levels come up, whether during a storm or something like that, do some of these animals kind of move into the uplands? How does that change their exposure to predation, where the vegetation community is much different? And then ultimately, kind of as I was suggesting before, this is all motivated by trying to figure out how we can adjust our kind of management of these coastal areas to kind of consider what the future might be like, and instead of trying to hold back some of these things that might be on the horizon, trying to work with them. And so, yeah, another example of kind of an applied sort of approach here. I'm going to shift to some of our work in Florida, where we've been working with this endangered species called the Florida salt marsh vole. We're using those bucket cameras here, and we've got a vole picture here. They're quite cute. And so, yeah, I started working with voles during my postdoc. And at the beginning, we were just doing some general sort of distributional sort of stuff, where this is an extremely poorly understood species. They're very hard to study. So the first thing we wanted to do is we camera trapped the entire Gulf Coast to try and find these guys, but we only found them in this tiny area around the town of Cedar Key. The other kind of thing that we found was that they tend to be associated with this specific mix of Spartina and Disticus, these two plants that are very tolerant of disturbance and very tolerant of stress, compared to Juncus, which is kind of more competitively superior, and without disturbance or stress, things tend to be colonized by Juncus. And so one of those disturbance that helps maintain these disturbance-dependent species is rag. So during a high water event, that high water pushes up the accumulated dead vegetation in marshes and piles it up into these piles. They sit there for a while and smother the vegetation underneath. That leaves these bare patches. And then this is a close-up of one of those bare patches where we can see some Disticus right here and some Spartina right here. So again, kind of this disturbance and sort of succession framework is what we're using for this study. And so what we propose to do is to manually manipulate these sorts of disturbances in a kind of experimental way. So we first had to go out and look for voles, because we don't monitor them frequently, and so every time we start a new vole project, we have to go out and find them. They're really hard to find. So we found them in around here. And so then we identified these kind of 3 sites or blocks in the experimental lingo. And then within blocks, we have 3 different plots that each got a different treatment. So orange is control, herbivory is purple, and these rack treatments were in this teal color. And so what we did here was Harrison, my graduate student, went out and for the herbivory plots went out with a weed whacker and just went and cut all of the juncus in these plots. You can see the kind of outline of this square plot here. These are 20 by 20 meter plots. Then we took all the cut vegetation and we piled it up in the rack treatments to kind of to simulate rack in a pretty realistic way. So this was, I have to acknowledge that this was a ton of work. And this is why our kind of sample size is quite low with just 3 blocks. Ideally, we would have done this with a bit more replication. But it was, it was very hard. They did it in Florida in the middle of summer. And then after all that work, just a couple of the rack sat there for about a month before Hurricane Idalia came through and made landfall essentially at our study site and washed all of the rack away. Which is kind of part of the deal when you're working in Florida, you gotta plan for hurricanes. But so even though the rack didn't sit there for as long as we had hoped, it did, dramatically change the vegetation. So this was one of our rack plots and you can see all the juncus underneath is very brown, pretty dead. I won't say it's definitely dead because, there's a chance that it could come back. But so we monitored these plots for 17 months after the treatments were implemented. And so this is showing kind of 1 year after, and then the top is before. And so you can see before, mostly juncus, mostly black needle rush, with some sites having some discus, some sites having some spartina. And then after, so in the controls, the orange, we still have a lot of juncus because they didn't get any treatment. But then the other 2, we were pretty successful in both of the herbivory treatments and the rack treatments. Successful in kind of reducing the cover of juncus. It's less clear how much we were able to the herbivory plots seem to promote disticus a little bit better. Again, this might have had to do with the fact that the rack didn't sit long enough to really kill the juncus underneath. But it was reasonably successful, I think. So ultimately, this experiment is trying to inform how we can maybe use the mechanical manipulation of marshes with a marsh master maybe or something like that. Some of these tools to try and simulate the effects of disturbance, the way that people have been doing for decades in more kind of upland terrestrial systems. So just some things to leave you with, I guess. I think a lot of the research around climate change is very negative. That may get depressing after a while. So I like to highlight that I think there's lots of opportunities for conservation in coastal wetlands in the context of climate change. Things are changing, but these are very kind of dynamic and disturbance adapted communities. And so they respond fairly well, fairly rapidly. And we've got a lot of management tools from other systems or unique to coastal systems that we can deploy. Things like prescribed fire and mechanical disturbance, which I was just talking about, but also other types of restoration like living shorelines, and then kind of trying to help facilitate that built-in resilience that I was talking about at the beginning with things like this thin layer sediment application. I always struggle saying that. But yeah, so I think there's lots of reason to be optimistic and for kind of how we manage coastal wetlands going forward. Some contact information here if you're interested in more about the work that we do. I've got my website. You can follow us on Instagram, and then if you have any questions, you can ask them now, or if they're longer or you're shy or whatever. Yeah, happy to take questions. Yeah.
How do you see edge effects affecting like salt marsh intrusion? Like on an island where you have like a lot of edge and not much inland, do you see rates there being higher than more so on mainland?
In terms of like ghost forest formation?
Yeah.
Yeah, generally, the kind of big factor is like hydrological connectivity, so how well is water able to move landward? And so in an island environment, like those things are much more closer to the water. And so that's definitely something that's important. And then, but even in some areas that's where there's kind of less islands, or where it's more of just like a shoreline and then you're on land. The thing about our North Carolina sites is there's lots of drainage ditches installed that were, previously for draining more upland areas. But now those are acting as conduits to kind of help that water move inland. So if you look at remote sensing imagery, you'll see, so the Fish and Wildlife folks call this the wedge of change. But like next to a ditch, there will be this kind of wedge that comes out, kind of illustrating how saltwater is able to move up those ditches. So that's, primarily how I think about those sorts of spatial things. Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
I was thinking about the data you were talking about with bird use of like the established marsh, and you weren't really seeing them use that successional marsh.
Yeah.
Do you think that could change? Like you talked about food availability and habitat structure. Do you think that could change seasonally with like breeding needs or food availability in the marsh versus the upland at different times of year?
Yeah, seasonally, I mean, yeah, that would be interesting. There's thinking about kind of food resources in terms of like those tidal macroinvertebrates. My impression is that there's not a ton of seasonality there.
So that is their primary diet, not like crustaceans or things that have a larval stage?
Yeah, I mean, there's probably, there's different species, and but like least bittern maybe are gonna take more like juvenile blue crabs and things like that. But yeah, when I think about like clapper they're kind of eating fiddler crabs and snails and things. So it maybe would depend on the species. But then as you get more into that transition zone, I expect there to be more seasonality. There's a little bit more like plant senescence and flowering, fruiting, seed producing is all kind of has seasonal timing to it, where there's like less of that seasonality.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure. Good question.
That was really interesting data. So
Thanks, man. Yeah. Other questions?
Well, how long does a drought need to be? Okay.
Yeah, that's the tricky thing with drought is that, and kind of saltwater exposure in general, is you can have these very short periods of high salinities that can kill trees, or you can have prolonged periods of like moderate salinities that will kill trees. And so generally, so I don't really know, but I would, kind of anecdotally, I would say like a year, probably, like these more prolonged droughts. So there is a seasonal component to this. So basically at this time of year, actually, kind of from late summer to early winter, there's this overlap in kind of in the Carolinas specifically, where we typically have a dry season in the fall. And then the trees are also still doing a lot of photosynthesis and a lot of transpiration. And so we see kind of river inflow reduced in the fall period, and that tends to be when salinities are highest, is in the fall period. Also overlaps kind of with hurricane season. So we get that kind of pulse of salinity every year, and it doesn't seem to kill trees. It's more of I think when maybe we get it. I think it's the like dry summers, dry growing season is really, because then you have a lot of photosynthesis going on, a lot of water requirements for trees. And so what the trees ultimately end up dying because when there's salt in the soil, that affects their ability to uptake water. Even though there's water in the soil that's salty, that's drawing water out of the plant roots. It's probably, so there's probably some seasonality, like the effects of the drought depend on when the drought happens, but then also those kind of really long year or more.
what's the geographic influence of droughts? Because like you showed the sounds, obviously they're being fed by upland rivers. like, if you're not experiencing maybe a local drought, but maybe the upland is, and like the inputs into the bay are lower, like which drought is it that's more important, local conditions or like upland as well?
So I don't think anyone's really looked at that, but you know, I think it's this watershed scale drought, and these are pretty large watersheds. They go up into the mountains, or at least the Piedmont. And so you know, that it's kind of tough to know. But generally, you know, these droughts that, I mean, we could look at the drought monitor map for right now, and I think it's showing that, you know, most of the eastern half of North Carolina is in some either moderate or severe drought. But if we look at that 2011. Yeah, so it's like the whole eastern half of the state is in pretty dry conditions here. So I don't think it's local drought as much. It's
Okay.
the freshwater inputs that are changing the you know, the salinity dynamics across the whole estuary. It's less about kind of rainfall falling in the stand itself.
Is there any groundwater influence on saltwater intrusion in these habitats, or is it mostly surface waters?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think it's primarily via the surface. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah.
There tends to be fresh water down below. That's what, like, on the barrier islands, they're getting their fresh water from a freshwater aquifer down below.
Cool.
Yeah.
As the salinity is increasing in these forest systems, do you see patterns in certain species that are like dropping out first in terms of like tree species? And is there differences, like certain species are lasting longer? And is there differences in like regeneration, tree regeneration versus like overstory mortality? What's happening, what's affected first?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm pretty sure there's some Clemson folks at the coast that are, you know, have done some work on different salinity tolerances between trees. So probably the most tolerant is going to be eastern red cedar. So in some of the transition zones, we get a bunch of cedar. And then, yeah, so pond pine and loblolly probably moderately tolerant. The first ones to go are usually the kind of bottomland hardwood type species. Yeah, I think cypress is a little bit more sensitive. But certainly, like I would think like Tupelo is pretty, yeah, it's not very tolerant of salt. But yeah, there's variation there. So we see kind of changes in species composition as a result of that. Yeah.
More questions? All right, thanks again, Paul.